everyone would please mute their lines. So I'm Megan Pistoles. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator with the St. Lawrence Eastern Lake Ontario Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. We are part of a statewide integrative approach to invasive species management based on collaboration. I'd also like to mention that there is a guided hike being hosted by our partners with the Tug Hill Tomorrow Land Trust this Saturday at the Trenton Greenbelt Trail off Wood Road in Nardville, New York. We have 5 spots left at this hike. If anyone wants to learn how to survey for and report HWA and become part of our invasive species volunteer surveillance network, there will be a link in the chat to this event if you're interested. So the first part of our discussion today will provide you with a broad overview of the threat that HWA has on our forests, in addition to showing you how to utilize a tool developed by the New York State Hemlock Initiative to prioritize your hemlock conservation efforts to prepare for and manage HWA. Taking time to prioritize your hemlock stands will give you a strategic advantage if and when HWA makes it to your forest. Plus, it helps strengthen protocols for or proposals for funding if you've already done the legwork for an area you're looking to treat and need funding for. The second part of the webinar will showcase experiences of partners who have used the Hemlock Initiative's tool to guide their hemlock conservation efforts on lands that they actually manage. We will end the webinar with an open discussion where the DEC will share their approach to responding to HWA on state, public, private lands, and also the SLELO PRISM terrestrial coordinator, Robert Smith, will share SLELO's response to the first HWA infestation that has been recently confirmed within SLELO PRISM boundaries. So our first speaker is Carolyn Marshner, who is the Invasive Species Extension Associate with the New York State Hemlock Initiative. Carrie, go ahead and feel free to share your screen.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Great. Thanks everybody for joining us. It looks like we have a pretty widespread audience. We have a lot of New Yorkers, but we also have folks here from Michigan, Vermont, and lots of Canadians, which is exciting. I'd like to say thank you to SLELO and especially to Megan for setting this up for us, and to recognize our funders, the New York State DEC, and also the U.S. Forest Service, USDA APHIS, and the U.S. EPA. So hemlock trees, why are we so interested? Hemlock trees are what we call a foundation species. They are a very common species that is like the underpinnings of an ecosystem, and you don't have that ecosystem if you don't have that species. Hemlocks fill a particular niche, especially in New York. They're the most shade adapted of our East Coast native trees. They're specially evolved so that their needles can take advantage of even those little sun flecks that come through a forest canopy and still photosynthesize effectively. And that's why you'll see hemlocks holding their needles pretty far down, even under the forest canopy, whereas the other conifers only keep needles up where they're getting a lot of sunlight. Because of this adaptation, these are really our only evergreen that grow on these north-facing slopes in shady areas, and also along streams and in our state, relatively unusual hemlock swamps. So they tend to grow in wet areas, and they tend to grow in shady areas, and we don't really have another evergreen that does that. Hemlocks support a lot of animals, and they provide this really unique niche or habitat within our hardwood forests. So if you're walking through the woods and you walk into a hemlock grove, you'll notice in the summertime that it's cooler and it feels very protected. That's because the temperature under the hemlock canopy is up to 10 degrees centigrade cooler than it is above the canopy in the summertime. In the wintertime, when you walk into a hemlock grove, you'll feel the wind speed drop because of that, the needles being held lower down. And it'll again feel protected, a little bit warmer. And I did find out last week that somebody has been told that hemlocks are the ever-feeding tree because they have these kind of floppy branches. And as the snowpack deepens, then those branches continue to come down and animals can continue to browse on them through the winter. So they provide a really good refuge both in the summer and in the winter for a wide range of animals, and they provide food and habitat for over 400 species. They're also really important to our aquatic ecosystems. Hemlocks, because they're evergreen, they're taking up water out of the ground in the spring and the fall when we have a superabundance of water in this area. And then in the summertime, when they're competing with the hardwood trees, they are not taking up as much water. And that's when we have drought issues. And so having those hemlocks in the landscape helps stabilize our stream flows because they're active at different times of year from our hardwoods. And it helps just even out the water that's going into our streams. They also help keep streams cool through a variety of mechanisms. They hold snow underneath that canopy later into the spring, which means that they're providing cold water charge, snow melt into the streams later into the spring, which helps keeps the streams cooler. They also provide direct shade because they grow in those riparian areas. And that's really important, especially here in New York, where we have a lot of cold water assemblages with trout that we love to fish that are right at the edge of trout's ability to survive the temperature. And so in our area, we really want to keep our hemlocks because if we lose them, we may lose our trout-bearing streams. In New York, over 3/4 of our forests are on private lands. So it's really critical that we engage land trusts, private land managers to engage with any forest conservation and certainly with hemlock conservation. Hemlocks are the third most common tree in New York, and we actually have more hemlocks than any other of the lower 48 states. If you look at this map, the darker the green, the more hemlocks there are. And so it's obvious that this ring around the Adirondacks and right here in the Tug Hill area are really, really critical for hemlock conservation because in these areas, the hemlocks make up more than 60% of the forest. And so hanging on to those is really critical. They're also very common in the Catskills and then all through this southern tier area, especially right in here. And then it looks like there's no hemlocks in the Finger Lakes, but it's totally not true. It's just that they tend to grow in our gorges, which are really narrow areas, and they don't always get picked up by the kind of modeling that this map was developed through. We really don't want to lose our hemlocks. This is what it looks like when your hemlocks are lost. This is Pisgah National Forest south of us. And I'm sorry to report that in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, they are working very hard to conserve just 1% of their hemlocks at this point. And the reason is because they have this forest pest, Hemlock adelgid, which arrived in Virginia in the US and then spread from there. It started taking off in the 1950s. And it moved very rapidly through the south and then has been moving a little more slowly up into the northern part of our continent. Just step back and give you a feeling for this kind of pest from a global perspective. This is a map of all of the places where there are native hemlock ranges. So there's 3 species that are in this Central Asia area. There are 2 more hemlock species in Japan. There are 2 here on the west coast of our continent, and then our 2 Eastern and Carolina hemlock here on the east coast of North America. All of these have a native hemlock adelgid that has been in the ecosystem for thousands of years, and that the ecosystems have figured out how to keep in balance through some combination of potentially perhaps some resistance in the trees, but also definitely predation from a range of insects. And we are the unlucky one area that has hemlocks that has not had a hemlock adelgid pest, which was great for us until it arrived. And now we have this ecosystem where our trees are not adapted to this piercing, sucking insect. And we also don't have anything that's eating that insect. So HW arrived in New York in the late 80s, spread through the lower Hudson and out into the Finger Lakes and up into the capital region. And I'm sorry to report that this one town up here in the Lake George area is now 4 or 5 towns, because there was a big find up there just this last August. I also want to point out that these 2 areas, these were not infested from this original movement. These were infested by nursery stock that was bought in the Mid-Atlantic region, grown in the Mid-Atlantic region, shipped north, purchased here in these cities, and then planted with HWA on it. So how do you identify HWA? What does it look like? How does it live? This is how you find HWA. You look for these white, waxy, woolly bundles on the undersides of Eastern HWA on the twigs, usually at the base of a needle. They're pretty easy to see from about mid-November through late spring, and you can see them beyond that. If you look hard, you can find them all year round, especially if there is an older infestation, because the wool hangs on through part of the summer. There they are. This is what they look like without their wool. Very, very magnified. This crazy child's loopy straw looking thing is actually its feeding mouth part. It inserts that down into the twig and sucks up starches that the hemlock intended to use for itself. That is not actually what kills our hemlocks. What kills our hemlocks is that each one of those insertions is seen as damage.
Okay, Carrie seems to be frozen. I will text her and see.
Damage from the perspective
there she
of the
goes.
tree. If you, what was I saying when I froze?
You were talking about it's not the insect or the penetration, it was something else that is seen as damage.
Thank you. So the tree walls off the damage, and when you have a big infestation like this, then the tree can't get growth. And that means it can't put on any new needles, and eventually it can't make any food for itself and it starves to death. So that's what kills our trees. In the South, trees are dying in 4 to 10 years. And in the warmer parts of New York, they are dying in closer to 5 to 10 years. In the colder regions, in the maybe zone 5 or cooler, it's more like 6 to 20 years because when we have those really cold snaps in the winter, it knocks the population back. It almost never wipes it out, but it knocks it back. And then the tree gets a chance to recover before the populations build up more. Adelgids have pretty complicated life cycles, and ours here on the East Coast, HWA has 2 generations per year. All of our HWA are female. There's an overwintering generation that you can see it sits here as a crawler for a long time in the summer and early fall. It's in like a hibernating state called estivation at this time in its life. And then it wakes up in the late fall and starts growing, becomes an adult. And then they lay that spring generation, which does not have that estivation phase. They just settle and immediately start growing. And then that second generation lays the following year's overwintering generation. This is what HWA look like when they hatch out of their eggs. This is called a crawler stage. This is the only stage that can infest new material, because once HWA inserts its mouth parts into a tree, it can never move again. And in fact, if it's dislodged, if it's dislodged, it dies. So this is the one time when you can move HWA, or if you happen to move eggs that then hatch and become crawlers. Once they settle, they're considered nymphs, and in that overwintering generation, when they settle in the summer, they just hang out looking like this all summer long. And they're very small at this stage. So this is what they look like. And this is part of why we don't necessarily often suggest people look for them in the summer. You can find them in the summer, but it's useful to have a magnifying glass if you're going to do that, because they're quite small. Then they wake up in the fall or in the spring, they just start feeding and growing. And then they start putting on this wool that we think protects them from desiccation and temperature fluctuations. Each adult can lay 50 to 100 eggs. Remember, they're all females, so it's asexual reproduction. And just to recap this, that overwintering generation estivates in the summertime. They wake up and grow through the winter, and then they lay eggs, which hatch, and their daughters settle in amongst their mothers on the same foliage, because it's early enough in the year that the hemlocks haven't put on their new growth yet. And then that quick spring generation lays their eggs, and when those eggs hatch, they infest the new foliage that has just emerged. So the reason this is such a problem is that the pest reproduces asexually. There are 2 generations a year, so 2 opportunities for exponential growth. And there are no native HWA predators. And that's why we have no control of these populations on the East Coast. And that is what's killing our trees. So how do you manage a pest like this? There are really only 2 options at this point. There's chemical management and there's biological management. And really at this time, there's really only chemical management, and I'll explain that in a minute. So there are 2 chemicals that are commonly used for management of this pest. There's imidacloprid, which takes a full year to become effective, but then lasts for somewhere between 4 to 7 years, depending on other factors that are impacting your tree. And then there's phytotefuran, which works right away within a few weeks, very fast acting, but only lasts for 1 year. Imidacloprid is widely available. A homeowner can purchase it and apply it as a soil drench. And then there are many other application methods that are only available to certified pesticide applicators in New York. Dinotefuran is only available to certified pesticide applicators here in New York. What we consider the best management practice for this pest is basal bark application. So this gentleman has roped in because he's working on a steep hill. He's got a 5 gallon backpack sprayer, and he's spraying the first 6 feet of this trunk. And the chemical is going to soak through the bark and get picked up by the vascular tissue of the plant and be drawn up into the needles where it's going to protect the tree. And you can do either imidacloprid or imidacloprid and dinotefuran together with that application method. Imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid. And as I'm sure most of you know, there's a lot of controversy around neonicotinoids right now. They're the most common insecticides in use globally at this point. They are what is on almost every conventional farm field crop seed that goes into the ground. And they are in flea and tick collars. So they get used in a lot of different ways. And this is another situation for their use. They're being used so much because there's not a lot of off-target impacts, especially to mammals, because these pesticides really are directly focused at the insect nervous system. And so they don't really impact mammals. In this situation, we would argue that this is not a high-risk application for pollinators. And the reason is that hemlocks are wind pollinated. They don't produce nectar, and their pollen is not of interest to pollinators. And so if you're going to use these on the landscape, we would say this is a good place to do so. But this is also part of why we recommend a basal bark application, because if you do the soil drench, any plant that has its roots in that area is going to pick up this chemical versus this more targeted application method. In New York, imidacloprid is labeled for bark spraying. And particularly if you use imidacloprid, you only have to do this maybe every 5 years. So you don't have to do it that often. And when you're considering whether or not to treat your trees, it's important to weigh the risks of treating of the treatment, which may have some impacts on your insect communities, versus not treating, which means that you're going to lose your hemlocks, probably functionally all of your hemlocks over time. And that triggers a cascade of ecological consequences as well. And so when you're weighing this, it's not weighing the risk of application versus no action, which is a no risk option. It's the risks of application against the risks of a significant change to your ecological communities. I'd like to speak for a few minutes about biological control. I work for the New York State Hemlock Initiative, and most of what we do is developing biological control for hemlock woolly adelgid in New York. Biological control is a very long-term solution for management of any invasive that works across the landscape in a way that chemical management just never can. And we think it's absolutely one of the most important long-term tools for managing HWA. But research is still in progress for these biocontrols. So there are two classes of insect that we're working with right now. One of them is Laricobius beetles. These are native to the Pacific Northwest. They feed on that winter generation. They're active in feeding over the winter while the HWA are growing. We've released about 17,000 of them, and we have confirmed establishment at 7 sites so far in New York, most of them in warmer areas, usually growing zone 6A or greater. The other kind of insect we're working with are these silverflies. They are also from the Pacific Northwest. They feed on the eggs of HWA, and they're active in the spring. So they're actually feeding on both generations of eggs. There are 2 species of Leucopus that are out at slightly different times, overlapping but different. We've released about 16,000 of these, but we've only been working with them for a few years. We have proven that they will overwinter in New York, but we have not confirmed establishment at any of our locations yet. So what we do is we collect West Coast species, we collect foliage from the West Coast hemlocks, bring them into a quarantine facility here in New York, because we don't want to release this West Coast HWA here on the East Coast, because that's not the strain of HWA we have here. We actually have the Japanese strain. And then we wait for these predators of HWA to emerge from the foliage, either as adult flies or dropping down to the ground to pupate for the beetles. We rear the beetles until they're adults and release them, and we capture the flies as adults and release them, and also do research. So in order to release a biocontrol in the US, first you need to go where your pest came from and research whether any of the predators, pathogens, or parasites are specific enough to even consider releasing them in a new ecosystem. If you find some that are worth considering, then you do extensive research to see if they are really okay to release in a new ecosystem, and obtain permits from the federal government to do so if they pass all of the tests. And then you can move into this phase where you are conducting releases and seeing if this biocontrol will be effective in this new environment. And that's the stage that we're in at this time. So we're working on it, but the biocontrols are not at this point ready to manage HWA by any means. We are still in the research phases. So that's my management piece. There's more we can talk about in the question and answer session if you would like, but I'm now going to shift into management planning. Which trees do you save? There are a lot of hemlocks in New York. They're the 3rd most common tree. There's no way we can manage all of our hemlocks. Let's look at the hike preserve, the managers for whom we'll be talking to you in a few minutes. Every colored polygon you see is an ecosystem that has hemlock in it. And you can see the scale here. This is 1/2 mile. So this is a lot of acreage of hemlock, more than you could even visit all in a year, particularly when you have everything else in the preserve to manage. How do you even decide where you're going to survey, let alone, and then which ones are you going to focus your attention on for management? Which ones are most important for the ecosystems you're trying to protect, for the goals and objectives of your organization? And then if you're working at a more regional scale, this is the Catskills region. Every colored fleck in here is where there should be hemlock. How do you even know where to start when you're faced with a regional management objective like control or conserve hemlocks across this region? One of the reasons that I think it's important to do this planning component is that not only does it help you focus on the most ecologically and culturally important resources to conserve, but it also helps when you're going to seek funding from your government or from a funding agency or from donors to say, we realize this is a very overwhelming problem, and we have done the due diligence to figure out which are the places where we should be focusing our resources. And if you help us do this, then you can be assured that we are focusing on the most important hemlocks to conserve. So what we have produced that we hope will be useful to land managers who are working either at a property or regional scale. We actually have two different tools. The landowner one doesn't have some of the regional questions, and then the regional one has additional regional questions. Each of the are these prioritization tools. There's a Word document, and you can work with this tool just by reading the document and thinking about all of the different components that go into figuring out which hemlocks are important to manage. And then if you want to go beyond that and do a very quantitative assessment, there's also an Excel file where you have all of the different metrics that you can look at. And you can put all of your stands or all of your properties down the y-axis and then fill all out as much as you have information for. If you don't have information about genetic diversity, which you probably won't, leave it blank. As long as you leave it blank for all of your stands, that's fine. It will still be a useful tool. So just use it at whatever level is useful to you. Early in the document, the Word document, there's a decision tree, because there are a few situations where we think you should always treat or never treat. One of them is if you are at the leading edge of HWA infestation, or you have a very isolated infestation. In this condition, your management of HWA is going to impact how this pest spreads across the landscape. And so whatever kind of stand you have, if you're in Lake George, you should be managing your HWA because they're trying to keep that from spreading in that area. And so it doesn't matter what the stand is like, you should probably be treating, and you should probably be treating with both chemicals if that's available to you, because the dinoteffuran will stop the spread more quickly than the imidacloprid, which takes a year to come into effect. If you have old growth forest, unless there's a really compelling reason not to, you should probably manage those, try to conserve those hemlocks. And in the case of old growth trees, that really does mean treat pretty aggressively, because the old hemlocks don't have as much vascular tissue per unit of tree. And they're already not moving as much stuff through they're not growing as actively. And so they're impacted by the HWA a little faster. And then as the HWA shuts down their transpiration in the needles, it gets harder and harder to get the chemical up to where the pest is to control it. And so particularly if you are limited by cost or by regulation to only imidacloprid, this is the only situation where we would perhaps consider, we would actually recommend treating before HWA actually is observed in your stand. If it's nearby and you have old growth, maybe you should be treating proactively. If your trees are likely to be removed, maybe don't treat, because you're going to remove them. I did just find out today that there might be some repercussions to selling lumber that has been treated with imidacloprid before you cut it down and sell it. I don't know a lot more about it, but it's something to think about. So if you're planning to log your trees, maybe don't treat them. Any other situation, we would say go ahead and prioritize them so that you can pull out the more important stands from the less important stands. So what are we suggesting that you think about when you pick which stands to manage and which stands to let go? The first category is stand traits, and anything that has an asterisk next to it is complicated. I think there are 4 complicated things on this slide. So the very first one is complicated. Stand health is really important for whether or not you're going to manage. If you are in the fortunate position where you are looking and doing your plan before HWA arrives, then you can look at stand health and say, if this stand is already not healthy, maybe let's not make this a priority stand for conservation. If you're in the less fortunate situation of, for instance, New York DEC, where HWA is in most of the state already, and they're overwhelmed with declining hemlock stands, then maybe when you're figuring out what you're going to treat this year, maybe you focus on the sicker stands to try to save them and let the ones that are infested but still healthy go for a few years. So stand health is really going to depend on what situation you're in. Size is important. A few trees mixed in with hemlock, with hardwood, it's not going to be an ecological disaster if you lose those trees. But if it's a big stand and it's a dense stand that's all hemlock, then that's really going to have an impact if that whole stand goes down to HWA. And isolated, we just talked about that on the last slide. Environmental stress. If your stand is suffering from compaction from a nearby road, or it already has a long hemlock scale that's causing it stress, or there's already hemlock rust that's making the trees sick. Maybe that's a stand that you don't prioritize as highly as an otherwise healthy stand. We actually decided to forget about proximity to HWA in New York, because except in those leading edge infestation areas, because it just doesn't, it's across most of our state, but that might be important in other areas. Proximity to water is important for survey, because often, not always, but often HWA arrives first on the feet of birds that have flown up from the south and they've landed to get a drink. And then we think this is why this happens. We think then the crawlers crawl on before they leave, and they crawl off and infest the trees by the water. We think that that's why we often see new infestations near water. Genetic diversity, if you're looking at one property, don't worry about it. But if you're a land trust that's working across many, many sites, or you're looking across the region, it's probably important to try to capture genetic diversity by conserving a variety of different kinds of stands across your landscape. If you have cold water fish in the watershed that you are looking at, it's important to conserve those trees that are in that catchment that are helping keep that snow on the ground later into the spring to help keep the stream cool. It's also important to conserve those hemlocks that are providing direct shade to water for those cold water fish assemblages. If you're in a drinking water watershed, any change is likely to be worrisome, and so maybe you should be conserving your hemlocks for that reason. If your watershed already has some water quality issues, like you're having hab blooms in your lake, that might be another reason to think about conserving your hemlocks, because you don't want to exacerbate those problems. There was a recent paper that showed through modeling that watersheds that already have HWA have flashier hydrology, which means that the streams are flooding faster and then getting more droughty. So if you already have a flashy stream, that might be a good place to do some hemlock conservation. Primary forests, places where there's pit and mound topography, where the land has never been plowed, those are really valuable ecosystems. Those stands should rank more highly. Rare systems, places that have rare species that live in the hemlock ecosystem, should be higher ranked. If you have a really nice forest versus kind of a weed pit, conserve the high quality habitat. Hemlock dependent species, there are a lot of them. And if you have several of them, maybe rank that more highly than one where you don't have those. Steep slopes, you might want to conserve because you're worried about the stability of the slope. But on the other hand, it's more expensive to treat on a steep slope. From a cultural perspective, rank more highly properties where you have support for treatment of your trees. Hazard trees, trees that are near public trails, near buildings, near roads, near power lines, all of those things should go into your metrics so that you make sure that you, especially if you have a public facing property, those things are really important. Any natural cultural resources, you have a stand that is part of the 200-year-old gardens, or it's part of the view shed for a spectacular state park. Those are more important to conserve. And outreach potential, again, if you're a public facing entity. And finally, prioritize places where you know those trees are going to be conserved. For instance, we released our biocontrols on a private property where they swore that they would never move that hemlock hedge, and we came back the next year and the hedge was gone. So preserved properties are great. Treatment feasibility is important. Climate resilience, we don't know a lot about it, but generally if they're already stressed because they're dry, maybe that's not a great stand to prioritize. When you're done, and you want stuck, you can report through IMAP invasives if you're in New York. There are some nice reporting tools through that. And my PowerPoint just crashed, so there's that. We also have a volunteer program called Hemlock Hunters, which helps you to collect the kind of data that you would need to do for this prioritization. And I was going to put up a very nice slide for Nathan, but my thing has crashed. So I think I'm just going to stop sharing and pass things on to Nathan.
Oh, yes. Thank you. So before we run off here to Nathan, do you want to field any questions that have been asked in the chat, or
I was already over time, so maybe I can answer a few in the chat while other things are going on, and then we can just roll them all into the questions at the end.
Yeah, sure. Okay, cool. So now we're going to hear from partners who have actually used this prioritization tool that Carrie's been talking about. And then we're going to learn more about the response to HWA across the state and also in SLILO. So if you have questions, just keep using the chat. I've been collecting them all and trying to answer them along with some other partners that are on the line. But we'll save open discussion time for the very end. Go ahead and take the floor, Nate.
Hi there, everybody. My name is Nathan Hayes. I'm the director of the Coming Nature Center. We're part of the Rochester Museum and Science Center. We're in Naples, New York, in the Finger Lakes between Canandaigua Lake and Honeoye Lakes. The Coming Nature Center, it's a 950-acre preserve, has 15 miles of trails. We primarily focus on environmental education and outdoor recreation pursuits. And ultimately, we're trying to help students and participants develop meaningful relationships with their local landscape. We have about, our hemlocks are overall, like they're unmapped overall, but we easily have 100 to 200 acres of large and dense stands of hemlocks on our property. We haven't seen HWA yet, but a neighbor land trust has been, less than a mile away, has been treating for HWA for, I think it's more than 5 years at this point. So it's probably here. We're still looking to identify it specifically. The use of the prioritization tool for us was critical. My world is like, I'm constantly managing, shifting and competing priorities. So we're doing education programs and I got to fix the building and we got to do trail work and we have bird watchers and cross-country skiers and really trying to balance all these experiences and max, make them the best we can for all. So, we balance like keeping the forest pristine versus like making a little magical environmental education camp for a bunch of 5-year-olds so that they can explore and play in the woods. So And we're also like over the years, we have had the balance like managing like the aesthetic value of our trail system versus income generated through logging. We haven't been logging lately, but that's always been a consideration of ours because we're a nonprofit. So, you know, we have a limited budget and we also generally have like limited expertise in this area. So I don't have anybody on staff who is dedicated to any kind of flora or fauna management at all. So I'm really reliant on grants to get a lot of this work done. I'm reliant on like Carrie from the Hemlock Initiative for advice. The PRISM organizations are really helpful for me. I get my, I get my mapping done from community college students. And just other partners. Like partnerships have been really key for us just because we don't have the finances to put someone on this this full time. So the prioritization tool was really helpful in terms of balancing all these little nuances with all the different things that we do. You know, through the use of the tool, we found that one of our priority areas is a rare hemlock swamp or hemlock bog, where we have Trollius laxus, which is spreading globe flower, which is a rare flower. You know, we work with the Cornell Botanic Gardens. They do seed collecting and monitoring of all those individuals. So that's really kind of our primary focus right now. And then we also, you know, a lot of our trail system goes through these hemlocks. So we're managing those managing those sections of our hemlocks because we don't really want our visitors to end up with with a hemlock wasteland trail. So we know those places would be higher up on our list to treat when we are able. And then the other big consideration that came to the forefront for us was just like the riparian responsibilities of the hemlock trees. You know, we have a slow, pretty muddy creek that flows through our property. And in the event that we lost our hemlocks, there is like the possible sedimentation could occur to Honeoye Lake, which is, you know, it's kind of like thinking about our neighbors. Honeoye Lake is already an at-risk water body in the Finger Lakes. It's a hotspot for harmful algal blooms. So, you know, just being a good neighbor and trying to limit any kind of negative impact that we can as a headwater stream, we want to think about as well. But like I said earlier, like we haven't treated anything yet. We're still looking for it specifically. I mean, I'd be shocked if we don't have it right now. But we got, like I said, we got hundreds of acres and we're still trying to find it. So we might have a little bit, we just haven't figured out exactly where. But then our next steps is like, we need to locate the presence, assess the population. And then for me, it's really, we're into a fundraising / budget appropriation for the chemicals. And then, you know, we just got to get on with it. We are lucky for this specific region here has a group of a bunch of partners who are looking at this locally. So a local land trust and the DEC, we're working together to try to maybe fundraise as a large group to you know, treat the hemlocks in our area. I'm happy to answer any kind of questions later on, or, you know, I'm happy to share my information if anybody has any questions, but yeah, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Anne, would you and Garrett like to take the stage now?
Sure, thanks so much. So my name is Anne Rhodes, and I am the Executive Director of the Edmund Niles Hike Preserve, located in Rensselaerville, New York, and I am just trying to share my screen, so hold on one second. Okay. Can everyone see that? Sorry. Here we go. Okay, so as I said, my name is Anne Rhodes. I'm the Executive Director of the Edmund Niles Hike Preserve in Rensselaerville. We are in the southwest corner of Albany County, about 30 miles from the state capital. We have about over 2,000 acres of protected lands and water, and 12 miles of hiking trails. We have 4 mission areas, and those are illustrated in the photos in this slide. Conservation, education, so similar to Nathan, we do a lot of environmental education. We've also been a site for biological research since 1938. And we also do a lot of recreational activities, including, as I said, hiking, but also swimming in our lake. So just like Nathan said, we also have a lot of hemlocks across our 2,000 acres. We have about 350 acres, and we know that because we had a biological survey done in 2016, 2017, which identified all of our hemlock communities as well as other ecological communities. And this is the map that Carrie showed earlier, but you can see that all of these colored areas within the green lines are our hemlock communities. I am a forest ecologist. I love hemlocks. I want to protect all of these stands, but as Nathan said, it's not feasible to do that. So we were really looking for a scientific and ecologically based tool that we could use to take our own gut feeling about what to protect out of the equation and really have a tool that would tell us what we should do moving forward with monitoring and managing our hemlock stands. So our hemlock stands are more than just, my favorite place to spend time. They are really important to all 4 of our mission areas. So the top slide represents their role in conservation. Carrie went through all of the reasons why hemlocks are important. This is a stand on our Lincoln Pond. It has a really important role in both habitat, terrestrial habitat, and aquatic habitat. It protects the water quality of Lincoln Pond, which Garrett will actually talk about in a little bit, is important for the town. It's also, the hemlock stands are also very important to research. We have several long-term research projects as well as shorter-term projects ongoing. This is a picture in the lower left-hand corner of Jim Runkle, who's been studying our hemlock stands for over 40 years. We also lead education programs, both during the school year, not during COVID, but normal years, and in the summer. And the hemlock stands are some of our favorite places to take students. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a new boardwalk going through one of our hemlock stands along Lincoln Pond. So we knew that these stands were important. We wanted to find a way to figure out how to prioritize management and monitoring. We connected with the New York State Hemlock Initiative to use their prioritization tool. At that point, we were using their draft document, which is a Word document, with guidelines for aspects of hemlock stands that we should really be looking at. And we received a grant from the New York State Conservation Partnership Program, which is a partnership between the Land Trust Alliance and the New York State DEC, to create an invasive species management and monitoring plan. Again, that was in 2018, and we knew that a part of that plan was going to focus on forest pests, and especially on hemlock woolly adelgid. So here, what you see on the right-hand side is that same map that I showed you earlier, but using that those guidelines from the prioritization tool, we were able to find 5 hemlock stands to focus our attention. So again, these are the stands that we would use to both monitor on an annual basis, looking for hemlock woolly adelgid, and also manage if there came a time when we found the hemlock woolly adelgid and needed to treat. And some of the variables we looked at some of the variables that we included were stand health, proximity to water, stand size and density, high quality habitats, primary forest, habitat rarity, management practicality, and cultural importance. And again, that's largely through our recreation and education programs. Garrett Chisholm, who is our stewardship coordinator, will talk to you in a moment more about those variables. And I show this on the lower left, that's Mark Whitmore, who leads the New York State Hemlock Initiative with one of our largest hemlocks in one of our priority stands. So we created that management plan thinking, that it would be useful someday. We ended up having to use it more quickly than we thought. The Hike Preserve did find Hemlock woolly adelgid in 2015 in one of its stands, but it wasn't detected again until 2019. So right after we created our invasive species management plan, we found HWA. And this picture here shows Charlotte Momborg, who used to be with the New York State Hemlock Initiative, leading a public event at the Hike Preserve in November of 2019. And this is in one of our highest priority stands, and they found HWA that day. Because we had the prioritization tool and we had identified this stand as a highest priority stand, we knew what to do and we were ready to go ahead and find funding and treat that stand. We did find funding through the Capital Region PRISM 2020 RFP program, and we treated the stand in May of 2020. So now I am going to pass the baton on to Garrett Chisholm, who is our stewardship coordinator, and he was hired largely as a result of our invasive species management and monitoring plan. We realized how important it was to have someone on the ground to do the monitoring work, and he has been the one really in charge of using the on-the-ground prioritization tool. So here's Garrett.
Thank you, Ann. Hello, everyone. My name is Garrett Chisholm, and as Ann said, I am the stewardship coordinator here at the Hike Preserve in Rensselaerville, New York. And I'm just going to get to sharing my screen with you all. All right, so as Ann said, I joined the team here at the Hike Preserve in January of 2020. And a focus of my position as stewardship coordinator immediately became monitoring our 350 acres of hemlock here at the Hike Preserve for Hemlock woolly adelgid. So as Ann had mentioned, prior to having this tool, we used the New York State Hemlock Initiative guidelines for hemlock stands, as well as GIS to better understand what factors were relevant for each stand in order to prioritize them. And then when we received this tool, I was able to take this tool and use it on the ground to verify what we had already thought through our initial prioritization. And so on the map here, you will see our 5 priority hemlock stands that Ann mentioned earlier. And I surveyed all of our priority stands using IMAP invasives to log our sightings, and ended up finding Hemlock woolly adelgid at 4 out of our 5 priority stands. So you can see this is from 2020, and the red dots are where I found HWA, and the black crosshatches are where I was able to search. So I was able to search a few of our outside priority areas and did find it at one of those stands as well. And so this tool was incredibly useful to have on the ground, to verify what we were thinking from our first prioritization. And it created a more precise way of looking at our hemlock stands while we were on the ground. And so here's a picture of an infested hemlock branch that I found at one of our stands, as well as myself using the IMAP invasives to log it, which becomes important later on when we download those points to use for a GIS analysis. And so some of the more important variables that we looked at when using the prioritization tool was the aquatic ecosystem services, because 2 of our higher priority hemlock stands are important for water quality for the town here that uses it as a drinking water source. In relation to the town, we also looked at the cultural value of our hemlocks here in Rensselaerville and how utilized they are by the community here and the overall public, as well as how we use them for our education programs as well. So those are really helpful, actually being able to see those while on the ground monitoring our hemlock stands. And so an aspect of the tool that became important was the variable of ecosystem rarity. At the Hike Preserve, we have numerous stands that contain hemlock, hardwood forests, and hemlock peat swamps, which are rare communities. And so while using this on the ground, this tool on the ground, and using these variables, it helped us in deciding to add another priority stand to our already 5 priority hemlock stands here at the preserve. And that is our priority stand number 6, which I pointed an arrow to on our map. So we were able, to use this tool. And while I was out on the ground seeing it, sort of in action after we had already verified what our highest priority stands were. And with that, I ended up also finding HWA, and now what is our 6th highest priority stand. And I'll continue using this tool on the ground in the future, going back each year and monitoring our highest priority stands. And with that, I would also like to thank the Capital Region PRISM, as well as the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the New York State Hemlock Initiative. And I'll pass that back off to Megan. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. So I think that what we'll do now is we'll move on to the next session, and then we'll have lots more time at the end to just have an open discussion on some of these questions that are in the chat box. I think that might be the best approach. So next we're going to hear from Brian Ellis, who is the DEC Forester coordinating HWA survey and response efforts across New York State. And then after Brian, we're going to have Robert Smith, the SLELO PRISM terrestrial coordinator, who will share the response SLELO is taking to our newly found HWA infestation. Brian?
All right, let me quickly try to share a screen here. I have got a couple slides I would like to show as we go through this. All right. Let's see. All right. So Carrie showed this map earlier. This is pretty much the same map, just a little updated. And she's asked me for it in the past, so I got to get it to her. With the new infested towns up by Lake George included in the map. So it just shows kind of how widespread hemlock woolly adelgid is statewide in New York. But we're fighting it on multiple fronts. So in New York, we are taking a multi-tiered approach to combating HWA. One, on fighting it on its leading edge to try to slow the spread of HWA, and then also looking at important hemlock stands within the infested areas to protect it, and trying to support landowners however we can in that effort. And Carrie talked a lot about prioritization, and that's a really important part of it. There's so many hemlocks in New York that it's so difficult. You can't protect every single tree, or even treat every single tree that has hemlock woolly adelgid, unfortunately. So Carrie also showed this map, which shows our hemlock distribution across New York. And if you think back to the other map that we just showed, HWA is really starting to get into what we would consider our breadbasket of hemlock in New York, up towards the Adirondacks, and some pretty heavy hemlock in Oswego County, where SLELO is. So, this is sort of the new front of HWA as it moves north in New York. So the state's approach, as I said, we take a multi-tiered approach here. We support detection and monitoring either through our own teams, through our support of IMAP invasives, as well as our support of the PRISM networks across New York. DEC contracts all of them to do their work across New York. So we try to take both a grassroots approach and a DEC approach for the detection and monitoring phase. With such a large area, and through challenges with COVID, we really do rely a lot on partners assisting with survey and detection, as well as the general public. So really getting the public involved in letting us know and monitor the spread of HWA across New York. And then we do try to take a targeted approach at controlling the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid. So I will go over an example here in a couple minutes about one effort that we made in Lake George to combat the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid in what we considered at the time to be an outlier population in that location. And controlling the spread of HWA is really a significant challenge. It's been talked about a little bit earlier in this presentation, but detection of hemlock woolly adelgid is very difficult, and finding it early on in an infestation can be very hard because of its size, its limited impact on the tree at low densities, and the cyclic nature where it might get knocked back because of a cold winter, and it might disappear for a little while or become much harder to find. So we've been challenged in that, but we've done our best to when we find it early to try to combat it where we can. And then it's managing hemlock woolly adelgid in priority infested areas. And some examples that we've done of that are in the Finger Lakes. We've supported our region in working in around some of the Finger Lakes. Hemlock Canadice Lake, for example, is one that we've done 25-acre consecutive treatments for a number of years now. And so that's a water resource for the city of Rochester. And so we've tried to support where we can the management of hemlock woolly adelgid and protection of hemlocks in locations that have a lot of value to either public for recreation or water protection, different important qualities like that. And then, we are also trying to work with land managers to restore impacted ecosystems. DEC has a number of tree planting programs, and we talk with a lot of landowners on, what to replant. And we've also been working at the forefront with the Forest Service on silvicultural methods to prepare forests for HWA, or to do new silvicultural treatments to try to combat HWA once it gets there. So, cutting a tree down with HWA is not likely an effective solution to controlling HWA because HWA is likely in all of the surrounding trees as well. So it would take quite a bit of cutting to really feel confident that you're cutting it out. And HWA can be found throughout the tree. So you might not have it present at the low branches that you're able to survey, but it might be present in the upper canopy. So that can be a real challenge. But we found that thinning around trees as well as increasing the resilience of that tree will help it survive an hemlock woolly adelgid infestation for longer. And there's also been shown some interesting correlations between light contact on trees reducing hemlock adelgid populations on the tree. Now, none of these are shown to be a silver bullet and to actually protect the tree long term, but it can definitely make the tree last, on the longer side of that scale that Carrie was talking about earlier, where, it might last 5 years without a thinning and might last 20 with one. So it's, something to definitely consider if silvicultural management is something that is an option on the forest that you manage. And then we support at DEC the New York State Hemlock Initiative and the biological control that they do each year through the EPS and funding through DEC. We support that biological center, and we help them find sites to do releases however we can. And we conduct education outreach, and that's a really important thing, creating awareness. So I'm just going to go over one of our, big infestations that we dealt with, and this is one we dealt with last year. And the right is a map here of, we found this is Lake George, and it was one of our early detection rapid response efforts that we've done, and one of the largest that we've done in New York to date. We had a report at the end of July of an infestation on Lake George from a camper who found it. So again, relying on the public to really assist us in these detection efforts is that we can't have eyes everywhere at the same time. After that, we pulled in a lot of partners, the local PRISM, the APIP prism. The New York State Hemlock Initiative sent a number of folks up, and other local partners like land trusts in the area assisted with this. And we surveyed hemlocks in the area and delineated the infestations that we have. It took over 100 person days to get the survey done that you see here on the map. So it's really time intensive. This was also done at the worst time to survey for HWA, as Carrie was mentioning earlier. The summer's tough, and we were, looking under needles with hand lenses because the wool wasn't present on this year's infestation. So that was really a challenge, and hopefully it will be easier in the future as we look. We then prioritized our grids based on proximity to HWA positive trees, put a 250-foot buffer on all of those trees to try to catch anything, and treated all the trees in gray here. And so we had a scale of green to red of how high a priority those grids were. Imidacloprid has a per acre limit of 256 diameter inches per acre. So we separate our grids, our treatment area by 1 acre grids, and then make sure that we don't over treat within each grid. So this is a visual representation of the trees that we treated that year. So, I think that's going to go a long way to controlling it. Now, in some of these really dense hemlock areas, we're going to have to go back for a couple of years to make sure we get all the hemlocks in the area. But, it was a good start. And we also did, the New York State Hemlock Initiative did some releases in the area. So that's just an example of some of the things that we do. I've talked with a lot of foresters about different silvicultural methods, and we're working on some demo forests, setting up some demo forests in different parts of New York to test out some of the silviculture. That science isn't quite there yet. We also conduct education and outreach. With the Lake George infestation, we did a number of traditional press releases. We also did a number of Facebook posts and reached 46,000 people with those social media posts. And because of that, that we did find a couple more sites around the lake and had a number of calls from folks, and have a better understanding now of the spread of HWA around the lake, and that this one infestation that we are working on isn't the only infestation around the lake. So as I've talked about in this presentation a little bit, it's really important to try to restore these sites, and planting other trees could be important. You really have to think about the transition of your forest. There is a lot of deciduous trees that will come up when you lose hemlocks, but in a lot of these areas, they are one of the main conifer species. When you lose them, you tend to not get pines back, just because you have an understory, and it's a little too dark. You don't create the light conditions for pine regen under there, even with the hemlock loss. Kind of the gradual fade out of hemlock leads to more shade tolerant trees coming back in those areas. So that's something to think about. Some things that you could do, plantings if there's a conifer that you want to plant to replace it. Or, it depends on the goals for your area. So it's really site specific on what you would replant. And that's pretty much all I had. In terms of funding, that is a really important part of all of this. And there's a lot of different opportunities, but there are a lot of needs in New York in terms of funding. The DEC has limited funds that we do treatment with. We try to treat those larger infestations on the leading edge when we can, and prioritize some of the higher use areas, or higher priority areas on public lands. So we really try to focus on public lands for our treatments. But for private landowners, I've seen a number of different grants come through. It's important to be kind of aware of the different opportunities. I know the Great Lakes GLRI, I think, put one out that some people have applied to in the past, as well as there's a number of them, but unfortunately they are limited and pretty competitive. So All right, I'm going to stop sharing.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Robert, are you ready to speak?
I think so. All right. And
And Robert Smith is the SLILO Prism Terrestrial Coordinator. Thank you, Robert.
oh, you're welcome. Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the HWA that we found in southwest Oswego County. SLILO Prism during the wintertime conducts many HWA surveys across our region. But today I'm going to focus in on Oswego County because that's where we found our HWA. So you can see that just Oswego County for the most part on the map here. This year we conducted 6 hemlock woolly adelgid surveys in Oswego County. And we plan to survey at least 2 more sites this month. Of the 6 sites we have completed a survey on, we found HWA present at 2 of them, which you can see on the map, and I'll refer to as site 1 and 2. These were the first finds of HWA in the SLILO region, and our response has been in accordance with our written early detection rapid response process. The following slides I show you will go into the details of this process at each site. Our field observations were recorded with the new IMAP3 forest pest data collection tool, which is a tool designed for professional staff in New York. This tool allows us to create presence and no presence area shape files along with data related to HWA presence. In addition, ecological attributes of the Hemlock Initiative's prioritization tool can be recorded with it. The information from this tool can also be uploaded into the IMAP Invasives website. On February 18th, Brittany Rogers and I surveyed Site 1, which is public land, and found just 2 woolly masses on 2 adjacent trees. One of the woolly masses was examined with a microscope and revealed what appeared to be an adelgid. Closer examination of the branch also revealed adelgids without woolly masses were present. Not sure why they don't have the woolly masses, they just didn't. We took pictures and sent them to Cornell entomologist Mark Whitmore, who then confirmed the identity as HWA. We then reported the find to the DEC and to the landowner. A meeting of the strategic response team, which consisted of members of the DEC, Hemlock Initiative, the landowner, and SLILO Prism, was then scheduled and held to discuss the next steps. One of those steps will be an additional, more thorough survey of this site to determine the extent of the infestation. Site 2. On February 25th, Brittany and I surveyed Site 2, which is also public land, and found woolly masses on most lower branches in one area of the site. We did not observe woolly masses in the lowest branches or any other part of the hemlock trees in other areas of this site. And overall, the health of the trees throughout this site still appeared to be good. This additional HWA find at Site 2 was also reported to the DEC and to this landowner. Both Sites 1 and 2 together were part of the discussion during our strategic team meeting. As with Site 1, an additional survey will be conducted at this site to determine the extent of the infestation. SLILO Prism is encouraging treatment of HWA at these and future sites for 2 reasons. The first being to protect the landowners' investments by supporting tree stand health, integrity, and resiliency to other forest pests and pathogens. And the second is to reduce the rate of spread of this invasive forest pest into other parts of our region. And that concludes my briefing about Sligo Prism's recent HWA finds. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So I do have a couple polls that I want to get in there before people start to leave. So I'm going to go ahead and launch those now. But while I'm launching those, if folks want to come off mute and just ask any questions that they may have, and our presenters and other partners that are on the call may be able to field those questions now. Brittany, if there's any questions that you've noted in the chat that you want to facilitate some questions now, feel free to do so while I get the polls up and running. Thank you.
I have a question about how individual landowners themselves would go about contacting the appropriate people at DEC and PRISM for advice, help, possibly getting a survey into their area if they either know of existing or reported adelgid sightings or have seen something themselves.
I can jump in on that. I think some of the best ways to contact us is if you sign up for IMAP invasives. That is a great resource for mapping the extent of these infestations. So just putting in a report to IMAP of HWA, including a picture of what you found. I get those every morning. I know Carrie gets them as well. So both of us, are looking at those reports statewide, reviewing them, and using that system to track HWA. If you have other questions about HWA, we have our email, which I can post in the comments. And I know the Hemlock Initiative also, takes a lot of questions from folks on that topic. So, we'd be glad to ask questions. Again, from DEC's perspective, we don't have a lot of resources statewide for all of that. So we do really rely on the public, these public reports and things like that. So we only, really send out, surveyors on a case-by-case basis and rely on, those public reports from folks for a lot of this.
Frida, I see you're from Chemung. We were actually just in your area. Steve Kinney and I and a couple of other volunteers were down there a couple weeks ago looking for HWA. So I would love to know if you know of HWA in that area, and if you have some places to recommend surveys. If you could reach out to me, that would be great. My email is cam369@Cornell. I'm going to put it in the chat box.
Thank you. Actually, I have not seen, and I was trained to look for it. I've not seen any evidence locally, but I was interested in becoming active in PRISM, and I started searching maps and found a 2015 report by a biologist, actually right on the ridge my Hemlocks face. I have one of those western facing ridges covered with hemlocks. And I was very concerned. But there were, although it said it was a confirmed sighting, there was, the entire form was not filled out. There wasn't additional information. And that's why I'm here, because I'm really concerned, because I'm not that far from sick forests in the Finger Lakes. And not that far from Pennsylvania either. Thank you.
Why don't you reach out to me afterwards and I'd be happy to chat with you about that. Also, I saw that a lot of people were interested in further assistance with the prioritization tool. At present, we're happy to help people think through that tool. If you reach out to me, I can talk with you or your organization about that.
I can just grab some questions from the chat if that is helpful. So there's a lot of questions about like the chemical applications and everything. Is imidacloprid labeled for bark sprays? I think that maybe Brian may have put something in the chat earlier about all the uses for imidacloprid. People are also asking about if it can work for aerial spray, if aerial spraying can work as a systemic treatment, and if horticultural oil is effective on all HWA.
Okay, so I can jump in quickly on a couple of those. So at least at the state, the application methods that we have used are basal bark spray and direct injection. Horticultural oil does kill hemlock woolly adelgid, but it only kills it on HWA that's directly applied to. And so if you have a tall hemlock tree, you know, it's going to be really difficult for you to get all of the HWA on that tree killed with horticultural oil. Also, because of what Carrie talked about in terms of 2 generations of year of HWA, you know, one adelgid left alive on that tree can quickly recolonize that tree. You know, we've seen winters of 98% mortality of HWA in areas, and you know, 1 year after that, the trees are covered again with HWA. So, you know, HWA is really quickly rebounds. So horticultural oils aren't really recommended unless you're, you know, willing to treat your trees, you know, year after year. And there are trees that, you know, maybe are 15 feet tall and you can get all the way to the top of them. So, you know, it's definitely a labor intensive. Maybe, you know, if you have a hemlock hedge, that's an option. In a forest setting, that's going to be really difficult. I have not seen aerial application of imidacloprid for HWA in a forested setting. I haven't seen it in an urban setting either. And we at the state at least really try to take a really targeted approach, you know, with basal bark sprays and injections so that we don't, you know, have non-target effects from trees. We try to stay back from water, only inject trees that are close to water, basal bark spray other trees, you know, that are safer to treat. So, you know, the effects that Carrie talked about in terms of these being neonicotinoids are something that we're fully aware of, and try to take a really measured approach when treating trees. For homeowners, there are, as Carrie said, you know, soil drench applications. There are Cortec tablets that I've seen used. There are some really effective methods for treatment of HWA. That most of the questions, Megan,
Well,
or were there other ones?
While you're talking about this topic, there's one about would HWA pesticide treatment fall under the forest vegetation category for applicators?
So we have category 9 applicators at the state. Though I think that is not the only application category that can work for this. I believe I am not actually an applicator myself. So this is not like an area that I'm as informed about, but I think is it category 2, Carrie? That is the other category that this is used for.
I actually just was emailing with Marshall, who just finished his applicator training, and he said that category 2 was okay.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. In the treatment limit per acre, there is a limit for dinotefuran and imidacloprid, and that's a per acre amount that you're able to apply. So we based on the concentration of imidacloprid that we're using, we can treat 256 diameter inches of hemlock per acre. So if you've got big hemlock trees that are 16 inches in diameter on your property, you're really not able to treat that many trees. You can treat 15 trees in an acre. So, it can take some definitely years to come back. Homeowner treatments would be, and a lot of this information is on the New York State Hemlock Initiative website. They've got a great resource and website for homeowners and a lot of this treatment info if you guys want to dig into it and a lot more after this presentation. But there are Core-Tec tablets, things like that are great. There are all soil drench applications that are available to homeowners. Yeah, I think that is most of it. In terms of the diameter limit, that's something that, if you have a certified applicator, they'll be able to tell you how much they're applying. They should, have that really dialed down. But that's, what we're able to treat based on, the concentrations that we put out.
Excellent. So Carrie, this one might be for you. There's some folks talking about wondering how, if there's concern about wind dispersing pollen and the treatments affecting areas due to the pollen of treated trees going places.
I don't have any information about that, but what I can tell you is that the amount of chemical that's used in this is very small compared to the agricultural uses. And this is a pretty spread out and diffuse use versus some of the other uses of imidacloprid. So I would say it's a little bit of a drop in the bucket.
Okay. And then folks were asking about if there's information about hemlocks growing in wet and swampy areas. Like if they're in dry soils, they can be more susceptible. What's the story for wet areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have hemlock swamps in New York. And so we know that they're pretty happy in wet conditions, but I have also heard our director, Mark, talk about extremely flooded areas causing physiological drought in hemlocks. And I don't really know how to think about that when we have this rare hemlock swamp ecosystem, but we're also expecting more heavy rain, so we might get more flooding. I'm unwilling to say you shouldn't prioritize wet hemlocks because we're really interested in those wet hemlocks, but it's definitely a knotty issue, and I'd be happy to talk more about it offline, as it were.
Okay, excellent. So also if someone sprays near biological control trials, will that affect the research? Like,
I actually I have messaged that person.
Okay.
But yeah, you can both treat and do biological controls. It's important to time them appropriately by waiting for a certain period after application, depending on which application method and which chemicals you're using. And there's actually a document that was put out by one of our partners down in Maryland that lays that out very neatly. So if anybody wants more information on that, again, reach out to me and I can provide you with what we've got.
excellent. And then there's questions about management and riparian buffer areas. And folks are interested in getting involved in the releases of biocontrol insects.
So if you, we have, again, we are in the middle of our research for biological control releases. We are interested in biological control release sites, but they need to meet some pretty specific qualifications. So again, if you could reach out to me, we can discuss what those might be, just so that you know it needs to be a place where there's a lot of HWA. The trees are still pretty healthy, and there's some low branches so that we can actually reach the research without tree climbing. And we generally we prefer protected properties, protected lands. Was there another question?
If anybody else has questions that haven't been answered, would you kindly just come off mute and ask them? Everything else I think has been covered and will be addressed further in a follow-up email. I did launch the poll for if you'd want to receive SAF credits. So if you didn't see that and you want to receive credits and you didn't get to participate in the poll, please just email me. I'll put my email in the feed here, plus it'll be in the follow-up email as well.
Hi, can we just talk about dealing with the HWA like within a riparian buffer zone?
Yes, and I'm hoping that Brian will correct me if I go astray here. But what DEC and many of our other partners have opted to do is to do the basal bark application until they're either overhanging or immediately adjacent to water, and then shift to a stem injection method, which is even more targeted and reduces any dripping into the water when you're doing the basal bark application. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just also curious about, we were talking about the silvicultural options like thinning and all that. Is that still recommended when you're closer to water? Should we kind of disregard that buffer no harvest zone recommendation in order to increase the hemlock health in those areas? Or is there guidance on that basically?
So Alex, like from like all like forestry answers, it really depends, I guess, on your trees. You know, if you can cut the trees and not be at risk for erosion, you know, it might be beneficial to do a little light thinning around some of those to try to strengthen some trees. It depends how heavy your HWA is and how advanced you are in that. You know, the more light that can get onto the canopy of the tree, the better your carbon balance will be in the tree, and the longer, at least the initial research shows that those trees will survive. But, you know, it depends, you know, on how your harvest method is going to be working. You know, I would probably have if you were able to have equipment restrictions and just, you know, hand felling and pull those trees out, then maybe that would be an option. The other option, yeah, I don't know. And it's definitely variable, and it's definitely still like a moving target and understanding how that's going to work. So, yeah, I'd be really cautious in those riparian areas, just because I know water quality is an important part of what you do in Albany. So, but yeah, those are also areas where we've seen pretty good response from hemlocks that have gotten a lot of light onto them. So
Cool, thanks so much.
in terms of the cost question, I think the estimates that we have seen, if you have an applicator do it, it's about $2.50 to $3 per diameter inch treated. So it's not cheap. And that's
for the tank mix, right?
For the tank mix, yeah. And so in terms of one way to cut costs on that is that your dinotefuran is going to cost about 6 times as much as imidacloprid for the same amount. So it's something to definitely think about which you want to use. You know, dinotefuran works really well for big trees. It acts a lot faster. So if you want to knock back the populations quickly, that's important. Imidacloprid can take, you know, up to 6 months to translocate through the tree and start killing HWA throughout the entire canopy. So, you know, if you want a really quick response, dinotefuran is important. But if you've got healthy hemlocks that you want to, you have light infestations you want to kill, you know, imidacloprid might be a good option and could definitely reduce your costs. in terms of application.
Brian, I'll just add that we have some estimates for a spring treatment here at the Hike Preserve. Your estimate is right on for tank mix. We had a $2.43 per inch estimate. And for the injection of imidacloprid, it was $5.38. So definitely always more for injection.
And it's when it's imidacloprid alone, what I have heard is more like $1 per diameter. It's much less expensive. And that's one reason to treat early, because if you are not dealing with very big old trees, in which case the dinotefuran will help, again, help preserve those older trees which don't have as good circulation, or you're not at a leading edge, or you don't have sick trees in a really heavy infestation. If you get ahead of it and you treat early, you can probably get away with imidacloprid only. Does that, Brian, again, correct me if I'm going astray here, but that's what my speaking line has been.
That's right on. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get across to, Carrie.
Okay. So,
And Nick, I see your comment in here about Nicholas. About the trees. I do not know about that. I have to look into it. I don't know if Carrie can elaborate on it. I'm not sure if they are rejecting trees. I would say that the cost, from a forestry standpoint, the cost to treat a tree, definitely in terms of hemlocks is not going to, outweigh the cost of, that you're going to get from that tree. So if you're thinking of cutting down trees, I would definitely not treat them, just because you're not going to make your investment back in terms of, that. So that's at least my initial thought, but I don't know about the, trees getting rejected or anything like that.
Carrie, you're muted if you're trying to talk.
I was just the person making the comment about the aerial spraying, because I've done some of that for the using the BT for forest tent caterpillars. And anyone that's got like a forest with like a few hundred trees, if you're talking about the cost of $1 per diameter inch, that's especially if you have a certified person doing it, you're talking about $100 per tree in some cases. Whereas if you do an aerial spraying like of 100 acres with an airplane, you could probably do 100 acres for a couple $1,000, which I've done. But that's for BT, but that doesn't involve a neurotoxin that might be more controlled. And that was my question. If the state could do maybe more research on aerial spraying of large stands, we'd have more information about whether it was feasible to look into that. That's in southern St. Lawrence County, where we have, I probably know 10 people that have done plane spraying for their sugar bushes privately. So that's a question, I guess, that I would have.
Yeah. So, I guess I have heard of that application method for forest tent. I think we've done similar things for, gypsy moth. But I will say, in terms of, use of imidacloprid and neonicotinoids on that scale, that's not something that DEC is working towards. We are continually trying to target our applications more directly, so that we reduce any potential for non-target effects. I know it does make it prohibitively, expensive for it, but based on a lot of the research that we've seen of neonicotinoids effects on pollinators and other species, I just don't think, honestly, that that's something that the state is looking to pursue right now. We're trying to really target our approach to protect, those other species. So it does make it cost prohibitive, and that is a huge issue with this kind of application and this pest specifically. But with the chemicals that we're talking about here, and it'd be difficult to figure out how you could do that on a per acre basis and stay within those diameter limits. thresholds as well. You probably would just be under, not really getting the bang for your buck that you'd really want and protecting your hemlocks. So I'm not sure. It's something I can look into, but I don't see the state moving in that direction, or I think there's been multiple bills looking at banning neonics in New York State. So
Thank you, Ryan. Probably I have 200 acres and probably it's 50% hemlock. So we're really concerned about it. Probably other people are too, I guess. But.
And rightfully so. Yeah. I mean, it's a huge concern with, how much you have on your property. It's an amazing species. So.
Yeah, Herbert, if you want to set up a time to talk with me, I can think about it with you. I know that Mark has been saying treat your biggest trees for a variety of reasons. And then, we're encouraging people to think about the things that we talked about in this presentation.
Great presentation. Thank you. Learned a lot.
Okay, excellent. So if there's no more questions, thank you all for joining us today, and either tomorrow or Monday, I'll be sending out a follow-up email. I just need some time to review the questions and make sure I got everything, and make sure I give you all the resources that you've asked for. And there very likely will be some webinars that will be put together that will showcase some of the topics that was indicated of interest by this group in the poll. So I will also inform this group if and when those happen. And I'd like to thank our presenters for giving all this wonderful information, and I hope everybody has a lovely day.